Change the taste and texture of your carrot cake by adjusting the size of the carrot pieces. In my first test, I shredded the carrots through the core side of a grater. The result was a cake batter with large pieces of carrots scattered irregularly. After baking, there was a similar sporadic distribution of carrots that gave the cake some texture and emphasized the flavor of the spices in the batter. For my next test, I used a grater to finely shred the carrots. This is the setting that most recipes call for. It allows for a better dispersion of carrots, and the finer pieces means more water from the carrots makes its way into the batter. This time, the cake is more visibly orange from the water released by the carrots, and each piece has a more pronounced carrot flavor. Finally, for my last test, I shredded the carrots through a fine microplane. The shreds this time were extra fine, and when mixed in, immediately disappeared and turned the batter a vibrant orange color. This cake had the most pronounced carrot flavor, and since the carrots were more easily able to release moisture, the cake was the softest of the three. With just a few minor changes, you can make an equally delicious pie with frozen fruit. Here, I'm demonstrating those changes with a pie made from frozen blueberries. The process starts by letting the fruit thaw completely. Because freezing creates jagged ice crystals that break down the cell walls of the fruit, the berries more readily release moisture. Save this liquid though, and add it to a pot along with water and sugar. While that mixture comes to a boil, whisk together cornstarch and water. The idea here is to pre-cook the filling without the fruit, so that the fruit doesn't further break down. Saving some of the sugar and lemon juice for later means that nothing is preventing the cornstarch from fully thickening the filling. After the mixture returns to a boil, pour over the fruit, cover with plastic wrap, and let cool. This makes sure that the filling doesn't melt the butter in the pie dough when added to the crust. Because the filling is pre-cooked, the focus in baking is just making sure that the pie dough is baked until golden brown. When finished, the final pie has a flaky and crispy crust, with a filling that shows off the whole fruit while also being perfectly set. When making bread, there are three methods to add heat and finish the process. The first is probably the most common, placing the dough on a tray and once risen, baking in the oven. When the bread hits the heat of the oven, the gases inside expand and cause the dough to rise, which creates a fluffy interior. The portion of the dough in contact with the pan browns slightly more, while the top and sides form a golden brown and firm crust. The second option is to let the dough proof and then fry in hot oil. The inside of the roll this time is softer and even airier than the baked version. Since the dough is flipped while frying, the top and bottom become equally golden. A crispy crust forms around the roll, along with a thin white band that indicates the dough was properly proofed. Finally, the last method is to place the dough in a steamer basket set over boiling water. The moist cooking environment makes sure the inside stays perfectly soft. Instead of a golden exterior, the dough forms a thin and chewy crust that completely surrounds the bun. Change how you mix the exact same ingredients to get two completely different cakes. In one of the simplest mixing methods, the sugar and all the wet ingredients are first whisked together until smooth. Then, in a separate bowl, the flour and all the dry ingredients are sifted together to remove any clumps. Finally, the wet and dry are mixed together just until no dry flour remains. This wet and dry method creates a banana cake with a compact structure and a tender and springy texture. With the exact same ingredients, another method starts by reserving half of the sugar and the egg whites for later. Everything else is added to a bowl and mixed together until combined. The reserved egg whites and sugar are used to make a meringue that gets folded in with the rest of the batter. This chiffon method creates a cake that is much taller and lighter than the wet and dry one. The banana cake this time has a fine and even crumb and a super soft and delicate texture inside. Instead of relying on a timer, practice learning the signs of when baked goods are done. For cinnamon rolls, the dough is still underbaked when it's a pale blonde color and offers no resistance when gently pressed. Even after carryover baking, the center of the rolls will still be raw and doughy inside. On the other hand, when the exterior of the dough is browned entirely and is completely solid, the dough is overbaked. This time the interior of the roll dries out, and the cinnamon filling leaks out the bottom and burns. You know your cinnamon rolls are finished baking when the exterior is just beginning to brown, and the center bounces back when lightly pressed. This happens when the center of the dough is right around 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Even when completely cooled, the rolls will maintain a soft and fluffy interior. This is episode 4 of my brownie breakdown series, and today it's all about how the eggs are incorporated into the batter. In the first method, the eggs are whisked together with the sugar until lightened in color and roughly doubled in volume. From here, the melted butter and chocolates are mixed in before moving on. The whole eggs are not able to trap and hold all the air mixed in during the first step, so the result is a rich and fudgy chocolate brownie. The second method starts by separating the egg yolks from the egg whites. The egg whites are whisked together with a portion of the sugar and gently heated over a double boiler. Everything is then transferred to a mixing bowl and whipped up to create a Swiss meringue. Meanwhile, the egg yolks are mixed with the melted butter and chocolates. Everything then gets folded together in the final step. Because of all the air trapped and held in the meringue, these brownies are much lighter and cakier. In the final method, the sugar is mixed and heated together with the butter and chocolates. Once cooled, the eggs are gently incorporated before moving on. With this approach, minimal air is mixed into the brownies. This means a denser and chewier brownie with the same intense chocolate flavor. To prevent a pie with a soggy bottom, choose the correct pie crust method for your filling. The simplest method is to work with an unbaked pie crust. To make sure the dough bakes all the way through, this requires a filling that bakes for a long time at a high temperature. Typically, this means a fruit pie like apple, peach, or this cherry pie. The second option is to partially bake the pie dough. Par baking involves lining the empty shell with parchment, filling with dry beans or rice, and baking for 20 to 30 minutes before adding the filling. This method is most common for pies like pumpkin, pecan, and other custards that bake at lower temperatures for a relatively shorter amount of time. Finally, the last option is to completely blind bake the pie crust. My favorite method to do this is to place another pie tin on top of the crust and flip it over to cut off the excess. Then, bake the dough upside down with another tray on top to weigh it down. By fully preparing the pie dough beforehand, you can fill the crust with an unbaked filling like for this lemon meringue pie. The most important ingredient affecting the spread and browning of your cookies is baking soda. To show this, I made my ginger snap recipe 3 times, and the first time left out the baking soda completely. The result is a cookie that holds its shape and has a dense interior. Adding 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, on the other hand, means that the cookie dough will lean more alkaline. In this situation, the cookie will brown more in the oven and will spread thinner before the edge sets. This experiment is so important that it's on the cover of my cookbook. Inside, you'll find more explanations that demonstrate how different ingredients impact your baking. I also created a flowchart breakdown that uses these explanations to show why a cookie like a ginger snap might use 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, while a gingerbread cookie might only use 1/2 teaspoon. As you add more baking soda, the cookie will continue to brown and spread, but may also start to develop a chemical taste. One important factor affecting your apple pie is the way you prepare the filling. The quickest method is to mix sliced apples with sugar, spices, and thickener and bake immediately. Because apples are mostly water, as they bake, they shrink and leave a large gap in the top of the pie. Another method is to pre-cook the fruit with the other ingredients and let cool before adding to the crust. As long as the apples are not cooked for too long, they will hold their shape for a final pie that is packed with apples. Finally, in the last method, the apples are mixed with a portion of the sugar and left alone for an hour. Next, drain the liquid and set over low heat to reduce before mixing in with the apples and the remaining ingredients. Because most of the water has already been removed from the apples, the pie stays full right up to the top crust. One important factor impacting your cookies is the type of chocolate you use. Most chocolate chips are designed so that they hold their shape even in the heat of the oven. This leads to a cookie with distinct chocolate pieces surrounded by plain cookie dough. There are a few chocolate chips that are instead designed to melt in the oven. This time, the cookie spreads slightly more and has separate pools of melted chocolate throughout. One more option is to chop up bars of baking chocolate. This allows you the ability to choose the size of the chocolate pieces. This time, the cookie spreads even more, and depending on the size of the chunks, will have lakes of melty chocolate. This is just one of the experiments I have done to better understand each ingredient in a cookie. To make it even easier for you to find the results of all my experiments, I partnered with Golden Set to make all my content searchable. You can start with any of the trending topics, get a summary of some key findings, and consult the original sources. Or you can search your own questions and have the AI-powered tool search my content to find exactly what you're looking for. This is episode 3 of my brownie breakdown series, and today it's all about the type of sugar used in brownies. In episode 1, I talked about why my classic recipe uses superfine sugar. This helps make sure the sugar dissolves for a shiny, crackly top and a fudgy interior. For my first experiment, I replaced all the sugar with powdered sugar. After whisking, the sugar completely dissolved and the mixture was aerated. The result was a brownie with a papery thin and shiny top, but with an interior that left a slightly starchy taste from the cornstarch that is typically included in packaged powdered sugar. For my next experiment, I used all dark brown sugar in the brownie. After whisking, there were still some visible granules of sugar. The molasses content of brown sugar can also interrupt the formation of a thin crackly top, but the same molasses helps create a brownie with a deeper and more complex flavor. Finally, as one last test, I used golden syrup in place of any solid form of sugar. Since the sugar was not crystalline, the egg mixture was not able to trap air in the same way. Because of the sugar makeup of the syrup, the final brownies didn't have any of the crackly top and had a solid interior with a slightly less sweet and intense cocoa flavor. With Valentine's Day not too far away, here are my best tips and my favorite recipe for the day. First, for chocolate lava cakes, when a toothpick inserted at the edge comes out with wet batter attached, the cake is still underbaked. Removing it from the oven at this point will leave a cake that immediately collapses after unmolding. On the other hand, if a toothpick inserted in the center comes out almost entirely clean, the lava cake is overbaked. This time, the entire structure of the cake has had time to set up, so instead you end up with a fully baked sponge cake. For a perfect chocolate cake with a lava center, a toothpick inserted at the edge should come out nearly clean, but if you insert it in the center, there should still be wet batter attached. This time, the cake has just enough structure to hold its shape when unmolding, but has a rich chocolate lava center. Second, when dipping strawberries in chocolate, there are three main options. The first is chocolate chips. Because they're designed to hold their shape when baking, they melt slowly into a thick and fudgy chocolate coating. Once completely set, the coating has a matte finish and bends when you try to break it in half. Compound chocolate, on the other hand, is formulated to melt easily and hold its shape without having to go through the process of tempering. This time, the chocolate has a shiny exterior and cracks slightly when broken. Finally, couverture chocolate contains a high amount of cocoa butter that must be tempered in order for the chocolate to set up. When done correctly, the chocolate coating has a glossy finish and a distinct snap when broken in half. Finally, my favorite Valentine's recipe is my coffee caramel creme brulee. Start by adding heavy cream, ground coffee, and salt to a pot. Heat until it comes just below a boil, remove from the heat, and let steep. Meanwhile, add sugar to a medium pot over low heat. When it's a light amber color, carefully strain in the coffee cream and let cool. Add egg yolks to a bowl, slowly pour in the coffee caramel cream, and finish with vanilla. Divide between 6 ramekins set in a baking pan and fill about a third of the way with hot water. Bake until the custard wobbles just slightly when tapped, let cool, and then refrigerate. To finish, top with sugar and torch. A thin and crisp layer of sugar atop a silky smooth coffee and caramel custard. Adjust the taste and texture of your cookies by changing the amount of add-ins. Making a plain sugar cookie means stopping right after adding the dry ingredients. When portioned, the soft dough fills the entire scoop, and in the oven, there's nothing impeding the cookie from spreading out thin and baking up crispy. In a typical cookie recipe, on the other hand, add-ins make up roughly 25% of the total dough weight. This amount creates a cookie dough that still easily holds together, but means that each cookie now has less dough and therefore less moisture. As a result, the final cookie better holds its shape for a thicker and chewier end result. Finally, increasing the amount of add-ins to 50% means there are equal parts dough and add-ins by weight. These cookies just barely hold together, and each individual scoop is packed full of extra ingredients. Since the add-ins create obstacles for the cookie dough as it spreads, these cookies end up being the thickest and gooeyest of the three. Shortbread are one of the most versatile cookies, and even better, the recipe couldn't be simpler to remember and to use. It's 1 part sugar, 2 parts butter, 3 parts flour. That means that the amount of butter is always going to be twice the amount of sugar, and the amount of flour is always going to be 3 times the amount of sugar. So let's say, for example, we want to make a batch with exactly 2 sticks of butter. That, by weight, is 226 grams. The amount of sugar in the recipe is half the amount of butter, and half of 226 is 113 grams. The amount of flour is 3 times the amount of sugar, so if I take 113 and multiply it by 3, we have 339 grams. So now I have the exact amounts for that size batch. But one more example before we go. And this time, let's say we want to hit an exact total. So I'm going to add another column here for total, and for the sake of this example, we're going to try to hit exactly 1,200 grams of cookie dough. If we go back to our base recipe of 1, 2, 3, 1 plus 2 plus 3 gives us a total of 6 parts in our recipe. And of those 6 parts, one of them is sugar. So I'm going to take the total amount for this new recipe that I want to develop, 1,200, and I'm going to divide it by 6 because that's going to tell me how much 1 part is. 1,200 divided by 6 gives us 200 grams of sugar for this new batch size. The amount of butter is twice the amount of sugar. Twice 200 is 400 grams for the butter, and the amount of flour is 3 times the amount of sugar. 3 times 200 is 600. Just to double check our math, 200 plus 400 plus 600 does equal 1,200. I have the exact amounts I need, and I'm ready to go. When making bread, there are 3 main ways to leaven the dough. The first and probably the most common is commercial yeast. Mix the yeast together with the flour and add water so that the yeast can dissolve and ferment the dough over time. After baking, you get a golden brown loaf with a thin and crisp crust. Inside, the crumb is light and airy, and the bread has a simple and clean flavor. The second method takes advantage of wild yeast in a sourdough starter. Keep the sourdough culture alive by feeding it daily with fresh flour and water. The loaf this time is equally golden brown and crispy on the outside. With a longer fermentation time and the benefit of the bacteria in the sourdough culture though, the flavor is more complex and slightly tangy. Finally, the last option is to use baking soda. As opposed to the first two options, baking soda is a chemical leavener and needs acidic buttermilk to react. To get the most out of this reaction, bake the loaf as soon as the dough comes together. The final bread has a crunchy crust, a dense interior, and a delicate sweet and nutty flavor. Let's fill a piping bag. Don't just start cutting things. Put the piping tip in and cut a little bit off to check. Alright, we need a little bit more, so we'll cut off a little bit more, and perfect. Snug without falling out. Now, roll the bag over your hand and use a spatula to fill it up. Once it's full, bring the bottom of the bag over the top and squeeze it down. There's a little bit stuck in the bag, so we don't want to waste that. Use a plastic scraper, push that down, and perfect. No waste, twist, and ready to go. By changing the mixing method in just a few ingredients, you can get exactly the cookie you want. To demonstrate this, I'm going to make the chewy brown butter chocolate chip cookies from my new cookbook. First, the cookie uses a variation on the creaming method with melted butter. In this case, I've opted to brown a portion of the butter and include toasted milk powder for an even nuttier flavor. Browning the butter removes some of the moisture in the cookie, so my next decision was to increase both the overall amount of sugar and the portion of brown sugar. This increase in sugar leads to a cookie that will spread more and highlight the toffee flavors. Mixing in the butter while still melted helps limit the air in the cookie, creating a denser and chewier interior. After adding the eggs, vanilla, flour, and salt, my next decision was about which leavener to use. Baking soda increases the pH of the dough and encourages the cookies to spread, while baking powder causes them to puff up. Because I want the cookies to both spread and have a chewy instead of flat middle, I'm using an equal amount of each. The final cookie has a distinct brown butter flavor, just the right amount of spread, and a gooey, chewy interior. One of the trickiest parts of making eclairs is getting the right texture when adding the eggs. You know there isn't enough egg when the dough still falls off the spatula in one clump. Stopping here and baking the dough would result in an eclair that is short and dense. On the other hand, if the dough quickly flows off the spatula, you've added too much egg and the dough is too thin. This time, the eclair won't be able to hold its shape and will flatten out in the oven. You know you've added just enough egg when the dough slowly slides off the spatula and in the end leaves a V shape hanging off. This may not take all the eggs in your recipe. Piping and baking the dough this time will give an eclair that puffs up for a perfect hollow interior. This is episode 1 of my brownie breakdown series, and today it's all about establishing my baseline fudgy chocolate brownie recipe. The recipe starts with butter and a combo of dark and unsweetened chocolate. The dark chocolate brings some sweetness to the otherwise intense chocolate flavor of the unsweetened. While still hot, mix in Dutch processed cocoa for yet one more layer of chocolate flavor and added structure to the recipe from its starch content. While that cools, add eggs, vanilla, and superfine sugar to a mixing bowl and whisk together at medium speed. Using both room temperature eggs and superfine sugar help make sure that the sugar dissolves and, as a result, creates a shiny, crackly top. Add the chocolate mixture to the sugar and eggs and whisk until incorporated. Finally, mix in the flour, but stop just before it's all the way incorporated to add the chocolate chips. This step makes sure to limit gluten development and prevent a tough brownie. Bake until the toothpick comes out with wet crumbs attached. In the next episodes, we'll break down all the major ingredients in a brownie and how to adjust them to get exactly the brownie you want. Sugar does more than just provide sweetness to baked goods. In cakes, its first role is to help incorporate air into the batter. The sharp sugar crystals cut into the butter and create tiny holes that later expand in the oven. Sugar also helps create a soft and tender interior because it interferes with gluten formation. The final cake rises nice and tall and has a soft and even texture inside. As you decrease the amount of sugar, you can't trap the same amount of air in the batter. Because sugar also contributes moisture to the mix, the batter ends up thicker. For a moderate decrease in sugar, the cake loses some height and the inside is coarser and denser than before. Since sugar also helps in browning, as you continue to decrease the amount, the cake will be paler. In addition to impacting the color, this also means the final cake misses out on some of the toasted and caramelized flavors. With butter and just a few additional ingredients, you can make 3 simple and delicious buttercreams. All 3 start by adding softened butter to a mixer and whisking until lightened in color and doubled in volume. The first option uses sweetened condensed milk to make a Russian-style buttercream. Add roughly a third of the condensed milk, mix, and continue with the next portion. In the end, you have a rich and creamy buttercream that pairs perfectly with layers of almond white cake. As another option, set a bowl over barely simmering water and add a combination of chopped milk and dark chocolate. Store over low heat until melted and then let cool. Once slightly thickened, just as with the condensed milk, add a little at a time to wet butter. You end up with a quick, silky chocolate buttercream that can be stacked between layers of chocolate cake for a double chocolate combo. Finally, for the last option, make a wet caramel, and once it reaches an amber color, slowly stir in the warm cream. To get the perfect consistency, continue cooking the sauce to 230 degrees. Once cool, the caramel will be ready to add to the whipped butter for a simple buttercream that tastes just like a buttery caramel sauce and pairs perfectly with layers of yellow cake. When making dinner rolls, there are two different ways to arrange them for baking. In the first method, space the dough balls apart from each other on parchment-lined sheet pans. After proofing, they'll still have plenty of room between them. This spacing lets you brush the entire surface of the dough with egg wash. After baking, each roll keeps its round shape and develops a golden brown crust with a perfectly soft and fluffy interior. In the second method, arrange the shaped dough closer together in a rectangular baking pan. As the rolls proof, they'll bump into each other and leave less space for the egg wash. Less space, though, also means that the rolls rise up higher instead of out. Since less surface area is directly exposed to the heat of the oven, the rolls will have less of a golden brown crust, and the amount will also vary depending on whether you grab an edge, center, or corner piece. Either way, you'll end up with soft, buttery rolls perfect for any dinner. The most important ingredient impacting the texture of your brownies is eggs. Using a relatively small amount of egg provides just enough structure and emulsifiers to help create a classic brownie with a dense and fudgy interior. Adding more eggs to your brownies brings extra moisture and an increased ability to build structure. The result is a brownie that rises higher and has a lighter and more cake-like texture inside. Finally, replacing some of the whole eggs with extra egg yolks brings more fat and emulsifiers to the brownies. This time, the brownie has an appearance similar to the fudgy one, but with a markedly chewy interior texture. There are two main ways to create a silky smooth filling in your key lime pie. First, a classic key lime pie starts by mixing sweetened condensed milk and lime juice together until thickened. From here, adding egg yolks introduces egg proteins that when heated, unfold and then bond with each other to set the filling. After baking and cooling, you end up with a silky key lime pie with a bright citrusy flavor. I started with the same amount of sweetened condensed milk and lime juice, but this time added sour cream instead of egg yolks. The extra dairy and acidity encourage the same type of reaction as with the eggs, but this time with milk proteins instead of egg proteins. The result is a key lime pie that has a soft and creamy texture and an extra tangy flavor. With just a few minor changes, you can make 3 distinctly different pieces of candy. All 3 start by heating corn syrup, sugar, and water together. For brittle, just before the sugar caramelizes, add peanuts and continue to cook until a light golden brown. At this point, turn off the heat and mix in a teaspoon of baking soda. The high heat causes the baking soda to immediately react and lighten the brittle. Once cool, the candy is thin and crisp with a few visible air pockets still inside. Honeycomb starts the same way, but leaves out the peanuts and this time uses a full tablespoon of baking soda. The reaction is much larger and causes the candy to puff up significantly more than before. The result is a thicker candy with a distinct crunch that is still light and airy from all the air bubbles trapped inside. Finally, sponge candy includes one extra ingredient. Once the sugar is light golden brown, gelatin is mixed in to give the candy more structure. After adding a tablespoon of baking soda and letting cool, the sponge candy holds its shape for a tall and crisp confection with an even and fine texture inside. One important factor impacting your cookies is the type of chocolate you use. Most chocolate chips are designed so that they hold their shape even in the heat of the oven. This leads to a cookie with distinct chocolate pieces surrounded by plain cookie dough. There are a few chocolate chips that are instead designed to melt in the oven. This time, the cookie spreads slightly more and has separate pools of melted chocolate throughout. One more option is to chop up bars of baking chocolate. This allows you the ability to choose the size of the chocolate pieces. This time, the cookie spreads even more, and depending on the size of the chunks, will have lakes of melty chocolate. I'm breaking down when and how to use each form of strawberry, all while making my triple strawberry vanilla chiffon cake. To start, freezing creates sharp ice crystals that break down the fruit. This means frozen strawberries are best in cooked applications where extra moisture isn't a problem. My favorite example is the strawberry syrup that I use to soak my cake layers. Ripe strawberries are best uncooked to bring an element of freshness and texture to a dessert. Sliced thin and mixed with a little vanilla sugar, they make a nice addition to the pastry cream between the cake layers. Finally, freeze-dried strawberries bring a lot of strawberry flavor without added moisture. Once ground into a powder, they go great mixed into a Swiss buttercream frosting. Altogether, the 3 elements make for a cake with pops of strawberry flavor all throughout. There are 2 main ways to create a silky smooth filling in your key lime pie. First, a classic key lime pie starts by mixing sweetened condensed milk and lime juice together until thickened. From here, adding egg yolks introduces egg proteins that when heated, unfold and then bond with each other to set the filling. After baking and cooling, you end up with a silky key lime pie with a bright citrusy flavor. This process is exactly the one that I used for the key lime pie recipe in my book. In addition to the recipes, I also include a portion at the end of every section that uses the recipes in that section as a way to learn about baking. In this case, I talk about how egg proteins are not the only thing helping the pie set up. To further show this, I started with the same amount of sweetened condensed milk and lime juice, but this time added sour cream instead of egg yolks. The extra dairy and acidity encouraged the same type of reaction as with the eggs, but this time with milk proteins instead of egg proteins. The result is a key lime pie that has a soft and creamy texture and an extra tangy flavor. One of the most important ingredients in blondies is baking powder. The first option is to leave it out of the dry ingredients entirely. Since this means there is little helping the blondies rise, the final result is short and compact. Because of the lack of air in the blondie, the inside is also dense and chewy. The second option is to include a small amount of baking powder. This time, the blondies get a slight boost and end up a little taller than before. The texture inside still leans chewy, but now is lighter and softer to bite through. Finally, the third option is to really increase the amount of baking powder. In the oven, these blondies puff up like a souffle and then fall in the middle when taken out. The texture is noticeably cakier on the edges, with a contrasting sunken and chewy center. Whether you make strawberry shortcake with a biscuit or a sponge cake base, here are the most important steps for each option. First, for the biscuit method, the type of cutter you use makes a big difference. Using a ring that has dull or rounded sides will squash the edges of the dough as it cuts. Because the layers have been sealed together, the result is a flat and dense biscuit. A cutter with a thin and sharp edge, on the other hand, can go straight through the dough without compressing the layers. In the end, you're left with a tall and flaky biscuit, perfect for layering with macerated strawberries and whipped cream. In the case of a sponge cake base, make sure you prep your cake pans correctly. When the tin is greased, the batter slides off the walls of the pan as it bakes. As a result, the cake sinks in on itself and becomes short and compressed. When the pan isn't greased, however, the batter is able to cling to the sides as it rises. This leaves a final cake that is perfectly tall and fluffy. This is episode 2 of my brownie breakdown series, and today it's all about the type of fat used in the brownies. My classic recipe uses all butter and starts by melting it together with the chocolate. For my first test, I started by replacing half of the butter with vegetable oil. The rest of the recipe followed as normal. Because the oil is a pure fat and is liquid at room temperature, these brownies were more moist and softer than those made with only butter. They also had a more neutral flavor. For my next test, I still used half butter, but made up the other half with coconut oil. Coconut oil is also a pure fat, but is solid at room temperature. The brownies this time were slightly drier and cakier than any of my previous tests, and also had a more pronounced chocolate flavor. For my final test, I started by browning half of the butter. After the water had been cooked off and the milk solids toasted, I added the second half of the butter. The final brownies had a texture that was the fudgiest of any of the tests. The brown milk solids also brought out a more complex flavor to complement the chocolate. One of the most important ingredients impacting the texture of your brownies is eggs. Using a relatively small amount of egg provides just enough structure and emulsifiers to help create a classic brownie with a dense and fudgy interior. Adding more eggs to your brownies brings extra moisture and an increased ability to build structure. The result is a brownie that rises higher and has a lighter and more cake-like texture inside. To best see how these differences impact the final product, my new book includes a flowchart at the beginning of every section. This allows you to compare the amount of an ingredient like eggs before flipping through the next few pages for full written recipes, and finally, a section at the end explaining how those changes work. The last option replaces some of the whole eggs with extra egg yolks, bringing more fat and emulsifiers to the brownies. This time the brownie has an appearance similar to the fudgy one, but with a markedly chewy interior texture. I'm breaking down when and how to use each form of vanilla extract, all while making my triple vanilla and butterscotch baked Alaska. First, pure vanilla extract is made by soaking vanilla beans in alcohol. The process brings out hundreds of flavor compounds that are most noticeable in unbaked applications like this no-churn butterscotch ice cream. Imitation vanilla, on the other hand, is synthesized to isolate and intensify the vanillin flavor compound. This means that the vanilla flavor will remain prominent even after baking. Here, that means in the chiffon cake layers that go in between the layers of ice cream. Finally, clear vanilla is a form of imitation vanilla that doesn't add any color to your baked goods. It's best used in applications like this meringue to keep it bright white. Stacked together and surrounded by a torched coating of Swiss meringue, the baked Alaska has an intense vanilla flavor all throughout. Change the flavor of your ganache by making it with different liquids. A classic ganache combines chocolate with warmed heavy cream. Add about 2/3 of the cream, let sit for a minute, and then stir together. Once combined, add the remaining third of the cream and continue mixing until smooth and glossy. The fat and dairy from the cream bring extra richness and silkiness to the ganache. This time, sub the cream for an equal amount of water and make the ganache the same way as before. Just a little bit of water will cause chocolate to seize and get clumpy, but adding more reverses this effect. In the end, you get a smooth and shiny ganache where the emphasis is purely on the chocolate flavor. To add other flavors to your ganache, try using purees. Here, I'm making a ganache the same way as before, but with passion fruit. In all three cases, if the ganache ever splits, use a hand blender to bring the emulsion back together. Instead of using pie dough, here are 3 other pie crust options and how to use them. The first option is to use a crumb crust. It starts by grinding your choice of cookie, cracker, or cereal into fine crumbs. Then add melted butter and mix together until the crust just holds together when compacted. Line the bottom and sides of your pie tin and quickly bake to set the crust. Then, fill with your choice of no-bake or pre-cooked filling like in this banana cream pie. For the second option, use cookie dough as the crust. Choose a cookie that holds its shape like shortbread or gingerbread and roll out to about 1/8 of an inch thick. Then line the pie tin, crimp the edge, and briefly bake to set the crust in place. Use this for fillings like pumpkin pie, where the cookie will fully bake at the same time as the inside. Finally, as the last option, get a flaky crust using phyllo dough. Build up the layers of your crust by laying down sheets of phyllo and brushing them with melted butter. Once you have a stack 6 to 8 sheets high, line the pie tin and cut off the excess. This is a great option for single crust pies that get baked in the oven, like in this pecan pie. The most important ingredient affecting the spread and browning of your cookies is baking soda. To show this, I made my ginger snap recipe 3 times, and the first time left out the baking soda completely. The result is a cookie that holds its shape and has a dense interior. Adding 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, on the other hand, means that the cookie dough will lean more alkaline. In this situation, the cookie will brown more in the oven and will spread thinner before the edge sets. As you add more baking soda, the cookie will continue to brown and spread, but may also start to develop a chemical taste. I want to take you behind the scenes of how I think about baking and recipe writing. My videos always include a comparison of 3 variations on the same baked good, but these variations only show one decision that can be made in a recipe. For me, ideally a written recipe shows all the decisions that can be made along the way. In January 2023, I had my first thought to write a recipe like a decision tree, where at each step I could choose which ingredient I would use and how much of it. Even better though, would be to spread the information out across 2 pages, and then include something like highlighting to show some classic combinations. In December, I came up with the first draft of what this would look like, and then in May of the next year, things really started coming together. Finally, in October, I had a version that accomplished everything I wanted. These flowcharts are a key component of my cookbook and allow you to visually see the differences in ingredients from one type of recipe to another. The flowcharts and the written recipes and explanations that follow help me accomplish my goal of having the book be truly a course on learning about desserts. Change how you bake the exact same pat of choux dough to get 3 completely different results. The first method is to simply pipe the choux onto a baking pan, press down any points with a damp finger, and bake. When the steam inside looks for different ways to escape, it creates an irregular exterior. Something you can also see by looking at the different sections formed inside. In the second method, the dough is sprayed with non-stick spray and dusted with a light sprinkle of powdered sugar. The powdered sugar helps with browning so that the exterior is a more even golden color. The non-stick spray helps keep the dough pliable so that the rise is more uniform. Finally, the third option starts by making a simple dough with equal parts of butter, sugar, and flour. Roll the dough thin and freeze solid before cutting small rounds to put on top of each cream puff. The result is a choux bun with an evenly golden brown and crispy exterior. The cookie topping also allows the bun to continue expanding in the oven for an even larger and more hollow interior. There are 2 main methods used to make marshmallows. Both start by sprinkling gelatin over cold water to hydrate. In the first method, corn syrup, sugar, and water are heated together and added to the bowl of a stand mixer. The whisk attachment is used to incorporate air into the syrup. In order to trap the air, cubes of the hydrated gelatin are slowly added while mixing. Stopping here leaves a fluffy and thickened marshmallow mixture. After setting up, the marshmallow is bouncy and super stretchy. It goes perfectly in a candy bar with an equal amount of dulce de leche inside. The second method starts by whisking egg whites. This time, the syrup is used to cook and stabilize the egg whites before setting the meringue mixture with gelatin. The meringue base leads to an even lighter and airier marshmallow that goes perfectly inside a candy bar with a thin layer of graham cracker, or on its own for a soft and delicate final marshmallow. Adjust the ratios of ingredients to get shortbread with the exact texture you want. A classic shortbread cookie starts by combining 1 part sugar and 2 parts butter. After creaming the 2 together, the recipe finishes with 3 parts all-purpose flour. This combination of ingredients yields a buttery cookie that is both crumbly and soft. Ratios are such an important part of baking that I included a section in my upcoming cookbook all about how to calculate and use them to scale and adjust recipes however you want. Crispy shortbread cookies start the same way with twice as much butter as sugar. The recipe differs, however, because it only uses 2 parts all-purpose flour and an extra 1 part rice flour. Using rice flour limits gluten and therefore changes the texture. This time, the shortbread cookie is crispier and has a sandy texture throughout. Finally, for a tender shortbread, use powdered sugar but keep the amount of butter as twice the amount of sugar. Using powdered sugar means a smoother and more delicate cookie dough. This time the flour has been reduced to only 2.5 times the amount of sugar. In the end, you get a delicate and buttery shortbread that melts in your mouth. Instead of relying on a timer, practice learning the signs of when baked goods are done. For pecan pie, when the top still caves in when gently pressed, the pie is underbaked and the filling won't completely set up. On the other hand, if the filling doesn't move at all when tapped, the pie is overbaked and the center will be dry and crumbly. You know your pecan pie is perfectly baked when the top springs back when lightly pressed. This happens when the center is right around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This time, the slice will hold its shape and the inside will be rich and gooey. With just a few minor changes, you can make an equally delicious pie with canned fruit. Here, I'm demonstrating those changes with a pie made from canned peaches. The process starts with straining the fruit from the liquid. To help control the sweetness and flavor of the pie, use fruit packed in 100% juice. Add this juice to a pot and set over medium heat. While that mixture comes to a boil, whisk together cornstarch and water. The process of canning softens the fruit, so pre-cooking the filling without the peaches ensures that they don't break down further. Saving the sugar and lemon juice for later means that there is nothing preventing the cornstarch from fully thickening the filling. Let the mixture return to a full boil and then let cool before pouring over the fruit. To limit the amount of time the pie is in the oven, add the filling to a blind bake crust and top with a streusel. The crumble bakes quickly and gives a final pie with a crunchy topping and a filling that still highlights the texture of the whole fruit. Change the way you bake your cookies to get 3 distinctly different results. The classic method is to bake in a conventional oven set to 350 degrees. Chocolate chip cookies baked in this oven and removed just as they begin to brown will have a crisp edge and a soft interior. As another option, a convection oven uses a fan to circulate the hot air. At the same time and temperature though, this might cause the cookies to brown too much. Instead, try dropping the oven temperature by 25 degrees. Now when baked for the same time, the cookies will have an even crispier edge, but also a gooier center. Finally, the last option is to air fry the cookies. This time, the high fan speed means the exterior sets quickly and leaves a molten cookie texture inside. I'm breaking down when and how to use each form of vanilla, all while making my triple vanilla custard cake. To start, vanilla extract is made by soaking vanilla beans in a mixture of water and alcohol. It's the best choice for adding vanilla flavor to batters or doughs that are going to be baked. Here, that means in these yellow cake layers. Vanilla beans, on the other hand, are best when the vanilla flavor from both the pod and the seeds can be infused into a dessert. The best example is when steeping the vanilla in the milk for this vanilla custard filling. Once scraped and used though, you can still make use of the pod by drying it out and grinding it up with sugar. This sugar works perfectly as a sweetener for the whipped cream that eventually gets folded together with the pastry cream to make the cake filling. Finally, vanilla bean paste is made from vanilla extract, ground vanilla beans, and thickeners. Because it contains the ground vanilla beans, it is great when you want visual specks of vanilla. For this cake, that's in this French-style buttercream. Altogether, the 3 forms make for a cake with pops of vanilla flavor all throughout. This is episode 5 of my brownie breakdown series, and today it's all about using cocoa versus chocolate in brownies. In episode 1, I explained why in my original recipe, I chose to use a combination of dark and unsweetened chocolate, as well as a portion of Dutch processed cocoa powder. In this first test though, I made some adjustments to leave out the chopped chocolate entirely and rely only on cocoa powder. In order to make this switch, I included more cocoa powder, but also had to increase the amounts of butter and sugar in the recipe. The rest of the recipe continued as normal following the sponge mixing method. The final brownie was light and chewy because of the extra starch content in the cocoa powder and had a really smooth chocolate flavor. For my second test, I increased the amount of unsweetened chocolate to make up for the missing cocoa mass from the cocoa powder. In order to not have to adjust the sweetness of the brownies though, I left the dark chocolate amount the same. The only other change that I made was to slightly decrease the amount of butter, since unsweetened chocolate brings more fat to the recipe than the cocoa powder. Again, the remaining ingredients and steps of the recipe stayed the same. This time the brownie was the densest and fudgiest of any of my previous tests, with a slightly more acidic but still deep chocolate flavor. This is episode 6 of my brownie breakdown series, and today it's all about the flour. For my first test, I substituted the all-purpose flour in the recipe with an equal amount of a gluten-free flour blend. The mixture is a combination of rice flour, starches, and other ingredients that are meant to mimic the effect of gluten in typical wheat flour. After mixing, the batter thickened and had a consistency similar to that of my classic recipe. The same was true of the brownies after baking. They were fudgy and chocolatey, with little evidence that they were gluten-free. For my next test, I replaced all the flour with almond flour. Since almond flour is not a starch, the batter did not thicken the same amount, but the brownies still had the benefit of all the chocolate, cocoa, and eggs for structure. Instead, the almond flour contributed extra fat to the brownies. This leads to a brownie that is even more moist and has a slightly nutty flavor that perfectly complements the chocolate. Finally, for my last test, I used mochi flour, also known as sweet or glutinous rice flour. The rice flour is entirely gluten-free, but its starch makeup creates a stretchy and elastic texture when cooked. This rice flour was actually the #1 ingredient in the gluten-free flour blend I used for my first test. Unlike the first brownies though, using all mochi flour created a brownie with a texture that was less fudgy and instead perfectly chewy.